Have you ever noticed that politicians struggle to enact things they run on? That regardless of who wins elections, lawmakers find that they cannot pass whatever legislation they like. They find themselves bound by what is popular, or at least their sense of it. They can only act within a narrow set of ideas, and that range is called the Overton Window. And on the Overton Window podcast, we look at issues across the country and talk to people who change what is politically possible. I'm Holly Wetzel, the Director of Public Relations for the Mackinac Center. If you're a young person interested in politics, you've probably been told you ought to volunteer on a campaign. It's the foot in the door for anyone. So what happens when you take the next step? What is their influence on policy? My guest today is Luke Derheim. Luke is the Legislative Aide and Policy Services for Rep. Bill G. Schuette. He's also a former district rep for John Molinar, who is congressman, and has been a campaign manager for Congressman Molinar and is currently the campaign manager for Representative Schuette. Luke, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
I should also mention, most importantly, Luke is a former Mackinac Center intern in our advancement and events department.
Yep.
So political campaigns are something that every one of us find ourselves at the target of. When we're going into a political cycle, how do you guys decide who to reach and how?
So it's different for every district. It depends on what you need. But the most important factors are how often does that person vote? And can we tell if they have a party preference? So if you're somebody, say we're running in a Republican primary, and you're somebody who has voted in the Republican primary for the last 30 years, you're our number one target. Simple as that. And then depending on, in a general election, if it's a district where things are very close, the number one thing is, do you vote? And then if you're a hardliner on the other party, we don't want to waste our time talking to you. So does it look like you can be convinced?
When it comes to convincing, are you trying to typically convince that you're the best candidate out of others in your own party? Or in a general election, are you mainly trying to get people to come out and vote?
So that depends on the specific election you're running. So in a primary, it's always you're trying to convince people that you're the best candidate out of your party. But when it comes to a general election, if you are in a district where it's a very safe district for that party, you could run a bagel with the right letter next to their name and they win. Then it is all about turnout. You're just trying to get as many people to come vote as you can. Or even if it's just, say, 51% of the voters in a district are Republican. I, as a Republican, am going to be very focused on making sure my Republican voters come out and vote, but I will then still have to reach over into independents and soft Democrats just to make up for any Republicans that don't come vote.
When it comes to targeting those independents and soft Democrats, what goes into that?
So we got to figure out what they care about, which, depending on the resources and the time that your campaign has, can be a very different process. If you're running by the seat of your pants, both time and money, it's literally just vibes. What does it feel like these people care about? What is historically, you can look at different elections. What have they cared about? We talk about the soccer mom voter. There's a set of issues that the soccer moms always care about. So you can play to that. But if you've got the time and the money, you can do district polling. So I've been fortunate enough to work on campaigns that did some quite extensive district polling, and we can figure out what swing voters in specific counties care about versus other counties.
Were there any surprises that came as a result of the polling that you've done as to maybe issues that you wouldn't expect people to care so much about, or maybe issues that you would think they would care more about but don't?
I would say yes, but no. I've never been surprised about the issues that people care about the most. And that may just be a function of, I know the region fairly well. But I have been surprised by how much or how little people have cared about issues. Because you can also say, do you favor this or do you favor this position? And then how much do you care about it? Mm-hmm. There are a lot of issues where 90% of people are on the same side. They just don't care enough about it to think about it when they vote. So that's also important to think about when you're creating a pitch, is do the voters actually care about this issue? They may agree with you on it. They may all agree with you on it, but that doesn't make them any more likely to vote for you.
Right. How far in advance does it come to planning for an election?
So again, that depends largely on the candidate's personality. I've seen candidates that never had a plan, and some of them were very effective. I saw some state rep candidates that never once sat down and wrote out a campaign plan, but they left the house every morning and they went and knocked doors for 12 hours. And that kind of work in a state house seat, you've got a great chance of winning. Some candidates they'll prepare a year in advance, months in advance. I would say the average is most people start writing their campaign plans in January.
Okay.
Yep.
You mentioned knocking doors
Mhm.
as someone who has helped out on campaigns.
Yes.
I know how tedious and uncomfortable that can be.
Yes.
As a campaign tactic, do you find that that actually is pretty successful, or what does that, I guess, accomplish for the overall
Yeah.
campaign?
I'm going to say, unfortunately, it is the most effective campaign outreach that there is. I would love if it just didn't work and I could stop knocking on people's doors all day every summer of an election year. But it is by far the most effective outreach. Um, the, the most effective outreach is the candidate knocking on a door. And then, assuming a basic level of competence, there are some candidates where that's the most effective way to make sure people don't vote for them. Like I think if you put Joe Biden on the doors right now, that would be a wild disaster. But yeah, it is the most effective way to get somebody to vote for a candidate is knocking on their door and talking to them about it.
Do you have any stories on what the wildest door knocking experiences have been?
Well, I think everybody who knocks doors for a significant amount of time will run into people that answer the doors naked. I have no idea why people do that. But I've had 3. I've also had people have medical emergencies while I was talking to them on the door.
Oh, no.
And that's also not a unique experience. But yeah, anytime you go and knock on doors, it's always gonna be interesting. Lots of people get bit by dogs. People get screamed at. Very, very rarely is there actual violence, but it does happen. We saw last election cycle a right to life volunteer got shot while doing doors, and she was, I believe, was fine. It was a small caliber in the shoulder, and she was okay. But yeah, things happen.
Wild,
Yeah.
absolutely wild.
Yeah. But yeah, I've also gotten invited in the middle of a hailstorm and given a plate of cookies. So,
the good comes with the bad.
right.
When it comes to candidates helping one another within the same political party,
Mhm.
how does that work? Do you find that there's a lot of crossover between, maybe a representative who's in a safer district compared to someone who's in a swing district? How does that cohesion work together? I know that it's probably going to depend on the election as well.
Mhm. Yeah, there's absolutely a lot of working together, and it can depend on if there's an organization that is organizing it. So, for example, the NRCC, the National Republican Campaign Committee for Congress, or here in Michigan, we have the HRCC, the House Republican Campaign Committee. Those groups are great at organizing like joint fundraising efforts and putting those into swing districts. In the state level specifically, they're also good at organizing door days and having candidates and politicians come knock doors for each other or their more vulnerable colleagues. And there is also just the organic, I'm friends with this guy and he's got a hard election, so I'm going to go help him out. That happens a lot too. And there's very limited candidate to candidate finance transfer, but that does happen as well.
We talked a little bit about door knocking.
Mhm.
What about phone calls? How does that work?
Phone calls are less effective than door knocking. And door knocking is very labor intensive. So phone calls are less intense. So it's a great thing if you have a volunteer that, is maybe not so mobile or maybe just not so motivated. And where I find that they have been very helpful is on election day, get out the vote calls. Because there are lots of people that you call them at 5 p.m. and you say, hey, have you voted today? And they're like, oh, the election's today. Like, yeah, your polling place is this, and you look it up for them and you tell them how to get there. So that they are very effective in the right context. If your entire voter contact plan is phone calls, I don't think it would go well.
I would imagine some of the day of get out the votes would be more useful during a primary, say a general election, or do you still find a
No, we still find it 100%. Even in like banger years like 2016, there were people, I was just a college Republican at the time, but there were still people that was like, oh, the election's today, or I only remember to go vote at 7 p.m.
How lucky they must be
I
to live
know.
under that kind of rock.
Yeah. Must be nice.
It must be nice. Ignorance truly is bliss at
It
times.
can be. Yep.
Especially during an election year.
Yeah.
Some of the more unique ways to build up rapport for voters, from what I've heard, have been county fairs, parades. Can you tell me a little bit more about, say, why going to a 4-H auction and purchasing a goat makes a difference in the long run?
So two things. First, parades especially, and then depending on what you do at the fair, it creates a lot of opportunities to talk with voters, either for the candidate or for staff, volunteers, candidates, family, things like that. So if you're just wandering around the fair, you run into your congressman, people find that exciting. That's kind of a cool thing. They're not at home, they're not in their pajamas, they're not watching basketball. So it's an environment where they're much more excited to see you. And it creates a sense that you, the candidate, are a part of that community. And that you bothered to come here. You bothered to go to the Clare County Fair. And people appreciate that. And it's the same kind of thing in a parade where they just appreciate that you're there. And there's less of a chance to talk to people because the parade moves. But people like seeing their representatives places, and they like feeling that they know where my town is, especially in northern Michigan where there's so many small towns. In my previous job, there were some towns where he would be there every year, but then every year we'd still have someone say, I never thought a congressman would come here. It's like, well, we've been here for the last 5, but good to see you again. And then in terms of things like participating in a livestock auction, that there's always a community of people that in every single community, there's a community of people that are probably less than 5% of the population that are involved in all of the things, right? They're in the Lions Club, they're in the Rotary Club, they go to city council meetings, they're on every board, right? And so that's one of the ways that you reach those people. And when you reach those people or you do something that those people approve of, they go and talk about you to their network. So you go to the 4-H auction, you buy some kid's chicken for $700, and the people that run the 4-H auction go and tell their friends who are on the library board, and they tell their friends who are on city council, and they tell their friends who are in the Rotary Club. So it's like force multiplier, but in grassroots marketing, basically. Yeah.
Now, is that something that's unique to areas like northern Michigan, or do you find those same types of tactics used down in Macomb or Oakland?
Yes, to both. The same tactics, definitely. The specific application can be different depending on the community. So it may not be a livestock auction. I will say in both the counties that you mentioned, there are still livestock auctions, and those are still very much a thing for politicians. But there are some communities where that's not the thing. But it could be, a Knights of Columbus cherry raffle, anything like that. It may not specifically be a livestock auction.
Okay. When it comes to parades, I imagine those can get tiresome after a while, but also just a great experience to connect with people.
Yeah, I have found the logistics of organizing a parade entry are a headache. But being in the parade, it's July, the weather's great, people in northern Michigan are happy, you've got a whole truck bed full of candy to throw at people. It's a great time.
What advice do you have for voters when they're analyzing candidates, whether in a primary or a general? And again, I'm sure it differs, but let's start with in a primary election when they may have already decided that they're going with a certain party.
So you always need to balance what you want. Something that we've seen play out the last couple of elections is voters may pick a candidate that they agree with 99% of the time over a candidate they agreed with 80% of the time. But then that candidate gets their pants blown off of them in the general election, and they end up with somebody that they agree with less than 5% of the time. So you have to do some math of how much do I agree with this person and how likely do I think it is that they can win a general election? Because somebody that you agree with 90% of the time is a whole lot better than someone you don't agree with at all, even if it's not as good as someone you agree with 99% of the time, but you really have to think about, is this person that I agree with 99% of the time gonna make it over the finish line? Because at the end of the day, the only people that get to go vote in DC or in Lansing are the ones that win the general election. There's no horseshoes. You almost made it, you know.
Absolutely. And I think you're probably seeing an uptick in that in recent years as well, just given party dynamics on both sides.
Yes, the more polarized the parties get, the more purity matters to primary voters. And the more often that comes back and bites us primary voters.
Now, once a candidate is in office, they get
Mhm.
elected, how do they still remain connected with their constituents back home?
So they keep doing a lot of the same things that they were doing during a campaign. And for representatives, both at the state and federal level, your election cycle is only 2 years, right? So you kind of just never stop running. It may not be as intense. You might not go to every single event, but you're still going to community events. You still go to the county fair. You still do the parades. You still talk to people. And the added thing that isn't there when you're running is you now have an office that people are calling and people are emailing and people are showing up at and handing you things. So there is both an element of you go and seek the opinion of your district, but then your district also comes and gives you their opinion, whether you asked for it or not. And both of those are helpful, but both of them can be deceiving. So again, you have to measure data and vibes, and you have to do the math. Because if we just went on, say, just the people that emailed, you may do something that 90% of your district is going to hate, because the 90% of your district that hates it didn't think they needed to email you. So you still have to be careful about what people are telling you. And generally, the safest thing to do is the time that you had the most exposure was your election campaign. So whatever you said you were going to do in your election campaign is the safest path because the people voted for you on that premise. But then obviously things come up that nobody even thought to bring up on an election campaign. So then you've got to figure it out on your own.
Right. And when it comes to figuring it out, here on the Overton window, we talk about how the window shifts based on what is politically possible at the time. And a lot of that political possibility comes from not only a lawmaker's interest, but also what they know that their constituents either want or what they can get away with depending on policy. So how do you take the temperature of what the general, majority of your constituency wants if there is that skew when it comes to those phone calls and emails?
Yeah, I'd say there's no foolproof way to do it. And none of us have the budget to be running polls in non-election years to see what people want. But a huge part of it, and an advantage that state representatives have over congressmen, is just living here. If you live in Midland, you deal with all the same issues that people in Midland do. You meet and talk to all the people in Midland. So it's much easier when you're here all the time to figure out what people in the district want. But then again, it is, people are the people that intentionally reach out to you. It's, you call people like the Midland Business Alliance and say, hey, what do your members feel about this? So you have to intentionally reach out, but you also just have to be willing to have your ear on the ground, so to speak.
I'm sure that engaging those key stakeholders is more important than ever when you're at a national level. If you're a congressman and you have a lot more ground to cover, those are the people who are going to be listening to those subgroups.
Yes, when you have 20 chambers of commerce, it's much harder to go and talk to individual members at those chambers of commerce. So you talk to the heads of those chambers of commerce and you ask them for, what do you hear with your ear on the ground?
When it comes to those that might want to join a political campaign and want to work with the end goal of being in Lansing or in DC, what advice do you have?
Volunteer. That's, at the end of the day, that's the only thing that is the most common way to get in, so to speak. Volunteer in a campaign, pick somebody you like, volunteer for them consistently, and then hopefully at the end of the campaign, they'll either hire you or they'll help you find a job. Because like many things, politics is relational, and building a relationship with somebody who is going to help you is the most important way to get your foot in the door. So pick somebody to build a relationship with it and do it by volunteering for them.
Okay. Um, when it comes to some of those different kind of groups, whether on campus, particularly geared towards young people, so on
Mhm.
campus or um, within kind of the community itself, what are other ways that I guess politicians try to engage and activate those groups for volunteers? Like, is that
Mhm.
something that they actively do?
Depending on the area, yes. To put it bluntly, we try to bribe them. You offer them pizza parties, or you sponsor their trip to a conference in exchange for volunteering so many times. Um, so yeah, there's always a balance of these are college kids that are interested in politics, and these are college kids who want to work in politics. Because not everybody who is in a college Republican, college Democrat group wants to work in politics or is even all that interested in volunteering. They just might like talking about it because they like hearing their own opinions. Um, so some people, everybody who's run a campaign has experienced this. There's going to be one or two kids that you couldn't get rid of if you tried. They're going to volunteer at every single thing. And there's going to be 10 or 20 kids that you're just trying to come up with any way to motivate them to come help you out.
Yeah, and it seems like at least here in Michigan, there are a lot of opportunities to go to events, and I know that that's something
Yeah,
that college kids love to be able to take a trip to Mackinac Island,
right.
or go to Grand Rapids or Lansing for a state convention. Um, how do you find that those major events are either helpful to a campaign, or can help you build support,
Mhm.
maybe financially as well?
Yeah, so they're very important for relationship building. Because so we'll just take the Republican Mackinac Conference. You've got people from all over the state that you wouldn't necessarily run into on a normal basis. And I don't care how long you've been in politics, you're going to run into somebody that has been in politics longer than you. So there's a lot of chances to learn. There's a lot of chances to build a network of people who know more than you do, and people that you can call. You're also going to run into people with purse strings that you can call for money, and then you are also going to run into those college kids and hopefully be able to recruit volunteers.
Do you find that the kind of talent pipeline for whether it be staffers in Lansing or people to help with campaigns, like is that still something that is more active than ever? Or have we seen that dwindle?
So the talent pipeline for either party really depends on how well they did in the last election. If you lose seats, there's less jobs, and people that are new and want in are going to have a very hard time. Now we have an election with a big swing where you win a lot of new seats that you didn't have before, and we'll be all the way at the bottom of the barrel looking for any warm body that'll sit in front of a computer and a phone for 5 hours. Um, because we can't even get them to be full time, you know. So yeah, it really depends on the election cycle. And the way to insulate yourself from that is to have a really, I'm not going to say extensive network, but to have a very solid network.
Mm.
A few people that you know their jobs are safe no matter what happens, or they have a reputation that, say their boss loses and they do lose their job, they're going to have another one the next day. And people who are willing to put in the work to help you. So there are a few people in Lansing. I'll call him out. Bob Anderson. He works for Timmy Beeson right now. Um, Bob has worked in Lansing for a long time now, and he always puts in the work to help college Republicans from Saginaw Valley find a job. And there's got to be at least 20 of us wandering around the state that Bob helped find jobs for. So finding somebody like that who's kind of plugged in the right spot that'll help pull you in
Mhm.
is huge.
That's awesome. It sounds like Saginaw Valley has a robust network of people in Lansing right now.
Yeah, Saginaw Valley is kind of a unique school because it is mostly a commuter school. So there's not all that much campus spirit, right?
Mhm.
But any SVSU grad who runs into another SVSU grad is gonna do them a favor if they get a chance.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Once you're in Lansing, can you describe what the kind of behind the scenes is when it comes to the average either representative or state senator's office? Are there people that do constituent relations versus more what you do when it
Mhm.
comes to helping out legislatively? Can you just describe, I guess, what that looks
Yeah,
like?
I would say almost no office are the lines hard and fast. But in general, in a state house office, you have a policy aide for constituent services, who we call a front desk, and you have a policy aide for policy services, who we call a back desk, or colloquially we'll call them a legislative director. And generally, the front desk does constituent work; they manage the calendar, that kind of thing, and the back desk works on bills. And that always kind of, depending on if one of them is slammed one week and the other isn't, you help each other out. It's not a this is my job, not your job kind of situation. Yeah, so that's generally division of labor. In a senator's office, you get more staff, but they're generally divided in a very similar way, and it's just up to that particular team how they've done it. Some will have multiple ledge staff and one constituent staffer. Some are the other way around. A lot of senators have somebody that works in the district on constituent stuff and doesn't really come to Lansing. So it can be very individualized for the representative, but in general, that's how it works.
What about for Congress?
So for Congress, the teams are much bigger. A lot of congressional offices are hovering around 20-ish staff. Usually, most of them are in DC, and then there's a handful back in their congressional district. Very few of them are the other way around, and I'd say a solid number are probably about evenly split. And generally, the people that work in the district are focused on the constituents, and the people that work in Washington, D.C. are focused on legislation. And again, there's no brick wall in between, but that is generally the separation.
Typically, do you find that staff are able to have influence when it comes to either alerting a lawmaker about an issue that the constituency clearly cares about, or even finding their own personal policy ideas?
Yeah, so your staff are your team, right? So you need to trust your team, and some representatives trust their team more than others. So in terms of, raising the alarm or raising the flag on a constituent issue or constituent opinions, we've gotten 5,000 calls about this thing. That's always the function of a team is, hey, boss, just so you know, we've had so many people reach out about this specific thing. We should think about this. We should have a conversation about this. And then also, many representatives think that they are entirely self-sufficient, but no one's infallible. So just having staff to act as a sounding board of maybe that's not a good idea. Have you thought about this problem with it? Or maybe we could do this to it and that would make it better. Or to pitch their own ideas. That's always a function of a healthy office. But not every office is a healthy office.
We've all seen the Schoolhouse Rock skit of how a bill becomes a law.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot more complex than what is portrayed in that cartoon. But at the state level, can you describe how a bill becomes a bill in the first place?
Yeah. So the representative will decide that they want it to be a bill, and there can be any number of ways that you arrive at that decision, whether it's a constituent calls and says, hey, I really would like if you guys did this. And the representative goes, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that. Or the representative just woke up in the middle of the night and wanted to do it, or the staff came in and made a pitch. Any number of ways that they decide that. Once they've decided that they want it to be a bill, typically the legislative director, the back desk, will contact the Legislative Service Bureau. And they have a team of attorneys whose job it is to take what we send them and look at all of Michigan's laws and figure out which law we're changing, or if we're writing a whole new law, and come up with the exact wording to do what we told them we want to do. Right? And they're also not infallible, but they are all attorneys. So they are generally better at it than the 20 to 35-year-olds working in the House that just say, hey, I want to do this thing. And so then they'll send us a draft. We look it over. We decide, does this do what we want it to? Does it not? We'll go back and forth a little bit. And then once we finalize it, they'll send us what's called a blue back, right? So it's the text of the bill, and the back of it is an actual blue sheet. And it's got lines on it for representative to sign it for co-sponsorships. So then the representative can hold on to that blue back for as long as they want until the end of the term. And they can collect as many signatures as they want. You will run out of space eventually. I don't know what you do if you fill all the slots.
Start writing on the blue back.
On the back. I mean, yeah, you could get another one, but another blue sheet. And then once they've decided that they've got all the co-sponsorships they want, and I'd say sometimes that number is 0. A lot of representatives just like having their own bill. You go down to the enrolling office and you have multiple copies of the bill, and they stamp the blue back with a number, and they stamp the copies with a number, and they keep the copies in the blue back, and they give you back one copy, and then it's a bill. And it takes a little bit of time to process and show up in the searchable online system. But once they've stamped it and signed it in the enrolling office, then it's a bill.
When it comes to finding co-sponsors,
Mhm.
is there strategy? Is it just anybody that wants to join?
There are as many strategies for that as there are for flirting with someone at a bar. The thing that happens most often is the office will send out an email to all the other office inboxes that just say, Representative so-and-so has a bill that does such and such. They will have it on their desk during session today and tomorrow. Come sign it if you want. So that's the most often just a general pitch to everybody. Sometimes you only send that to one party or the other. Sometimes the representative will take it and make specific pitches to specific members because they want a specific coalition behind that bill. And like I said, sometimes they don't bother at all.
Interesting. So, how has your experience been getting kind of an inside look at politics and then, policy changes?
Mhm.
How has that changed any of your views on either how the system works or a particular policy in general?
Yeah. So I'd say the thing that was most eye-opening for me to realize, which is actually very relevant to the Overton window, was that politicians are people too, and they operate under incentives just like the rest of us. So I can't tell you how many times I've heard somebody criticize someone by saying they're only doing that to get reelected. Well, we don't look at anybody else and say, you're only doing your job like that because you want to keep your job. We don't get mad at anyone else for doing their job in a way that lets them keep their job. We don't expect anyone else to do their job in a way that gets them fired. And so realizing that really made me rethink what's the politician's fault and what's our fault as a public. And that if we really want things to be different, we need to change the behavior that we reward. So just to take a specific example, we can tell the mayor of Detroit that stadium subsidies are a bad idea until we're blue in the face. I know John Mazzina has. But until the voters of Detroit decide that subsidizing a stadium is going to make you less likely to vote for this guy for reelection instead of more likely, it's not going to do anything. So realizing that, and sometimes the politicians are wrong about what the voters want, and sometimes they just decide that this is important enough that I'm going to ignore the voters. And there's a whole discussion about the morality of representing and how much of it is your own judgment and how much of it is what your constituents want. But that's a whole different podcast. But so coming to understand that, we can tell politicians that they need to live to a higher standard all we want. They're still people, and they're still going to operate under the same incentives that the rest of us do. And the primary incentive that a lot of us are operating on is I want to keep my job.
I'm sure that incentive has become a lot more important in the kind of the turbulent political climate that we live in right now with primaries.
For some people, it's more important, and for some people, it's less. We've seen a lot of very respected and senior members of Congress just quit this year, not even finish their terms. So some people have just decided they're done with it. But for people that are not done with it, you're right. It is a much trickier and much more important thing that you have to spend a lot of time thinking about.
Any additional advice for those looking to get involved in politics or policy?
Well, if you're a Republican, you should call me. But generally, yeah, just volunteer, be involved. The only way you're going to get involved is by being involved.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
The discussion.
Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Overton Window, a podcast from the Mackinac Center. Please subscribe and rate. For more, check us out at www.mackinac.org. That's Mackinac with a C, like the island.